I've always been a big fan of the spooky, the scary, and the otherworldly. And since I've always loved the very non-supernatural Holmes stories just as much as the grotesque horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, I thought I'd try to understand why I'm so drawn to both. Just in case anyone is not familiar with Lovecraft, here's some quick background. Lovecraft's universe is not terribly consistent and cohesive, but the basic idea is that there are monstrous entities with names like Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth who existed in the vast reaches of space long before there were humans on Earth. They vary in size and appearance, but are uniformly horrifying and often combine aspects of an octopus, a dragon, and a bat. Tentacles are almost always involved. At some point in the distant past, these entities, sometimes referred to as the Old Ones or the Elder Gods, arrived on Earth, established a great civilization, ruled for a while, and eventually became dormant in vast underground or undersea dwellings. Some of them maintained contact with a few chosen humans through dreams and arcane rituals, and occasionally even interbreed with us. I don't think Lovecraft had a very good understanding of genetics. Eventually, when the stars are right, they will rise again from the sea or return from the stars, depending on the story, and reclaim their place as the rulers of Earth. And things will go very badly for us when that happens. Many of the stories take place in Lovecraft's home region of New England, especially in the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts, and the remote rural areas surrounding it. There's also a forbidden book called the Necronomicon that contains a lot of the lore of the Old Ones, along with handy instructions for raising the dead, taking over other people's bodies, commanding the power of dark spirits, and lots of other fun spare time projects. Unfortunately, most people who try to read it wind up going mad or committing suicide, so you're probably better off sticking with Pinterest for your crafting ideas. So that's Lovecraft in a nutshell. At first glance, it's hard to imagine two literary landscapes with less in common than the prosaic Victorian England of Holmes and Watson and the terrifying universe of cosmic horrors and eldritch monstrosities of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. But for many readers, myself included, these two worlds are equally compelling. The list of Sherlockians who are also Lovecraft fans includes such notables as Vincent Sterrett, Leslie Klinger, and August Derleth. And for many writers, the fascination leads to pastiches and mashups featuring Holmes and Watson encountering the monstrous denizens of Lovecraft's vast, inhuman cosmos with strikingly mixed results. A quick search on Amazon reveals a long list of Doyle Lovecraft liaisons, including books by James Lovegrove, Lois Gresh, Ralph Vaughan, James Boswell, and my personal favorite, Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald. In this seriously creepy novella, our world has already been conquered by the Old Ones from beyond the stars, and two sets of Holmes-Watson analogs, one on the side of the Old Ones and one on the side of the human resistance, match wits with the fate of humanity at stake. Literary critics also tend to love both the Holmes and the Lovecraft canons, except for those misguided souls who despise both. Edmund Wilson, the so-called dean of American critics, sniffed, "The Lovecraft cult, I fear, is on an even more infantile level than the Baker Street irregulars and the cult of Sherlock Holmes." But Vincent Sterrett, author of the famous 221B sonnet and a much more enlightened critic, carried on a friendly correspondence with Lovecraft in the 1920s, appreciated his fiction, and wrote an enthusiastic review in his Chicago Sun-Times column. Even Lovecraft himself was a Sherlockian. He encountered Holmes early in life and quickly became a fan. As he wrote to his friend Alfred Galpin, "As to Sherlock Holmes, I used to be infatuated with him. I read every Sherlock Holmes story published and even organized a detective agency when I was 13. And although Doyle is most famous for the Holmes canon, he also wrote scary supernatural stories involving ghosts, mummies, subterranean monsters, and floating creatures of the upper atmosphere. So why all the overlap? You'd think that if you were drawn to the scientific, materialistic, logical atmosphere of 221B, you wouldn't have much use for the starry depths and bizarre creatures of Lovecraft's universe, and vice versa. The disparities are just so great. Holmes strongly rejects any hint of the supernatural. As he tells Watson in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, "The agency stands flat-footed on the ground, and there it must remain. The world is big enough for us. No ghosts need apply." whereas the unnamed narrator of The Call of Cthulhu starts with just such a rational outlook, but reluctantly comes to acknowledge that we live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. Holmes was so far from being interested in black seas of infinity that he didn't even know the Earth revolved around the sun, although he might have been pulling Watson's leg when he said that. Speaking of unnamed narrators, Lovecraft never created or even attempted the kind of finely drawn, engaging characters that Conan Doyle brought to life so beautifully in Holmes and Watson. The wonderful interplay of these two distinctive personalities is one of the great delights of the Holmes canon, but there's no equivalent in Lovecraft's work. Instead, Lovecraft's characters and narrators, even when they have names, rarely take on the vibrancy of Holmes and Watson, but are rather overshadowed by the various cosmic horrors which they unwillingly witness. In his essay, In Defense of Dagon, Lovecraft himself said, "Man's relations to man do not captivate my fancy. It is man's relation to the cosmos, to the unknown, which alone arouses in me the spark of creative imagination." Along with engaging characters, the Holmes canon offers us an almost cozy environment in Victorian London. For Doyle's initial readers, the setting was basically their daily life. Even for us in the 21st century, Holmes's world is not that far from our own. We have more automobiles, airplanes, and television, and less horse manure, coal smoke, and institutional patriarchy. But most of us could feel pretty much at home in Baker Street. Lovecraft, on the other hand, starts in an already creepy old New England and then tries to drag us into the void between the stars, the ancient cyclopean cities in the depths of the sea, and the limitless caverns beneath our feet. But looking deeper, these two literary worlds may have a great deal in common in spite of their obvious differences. One reason I read fiction is to be transported to another time and place. Through Conan Doyle's beautiful evocation of the late Victorian world, I can step out of the sitting room at 221B into the streets of London, take a hansom cab to Victoria Station, and journey along the British railway lines to the hills of Sussex or the desolate moors of Devon. I might even make my way to a seaport where I can board a steamship for North or South America, Africa, or India. If I work up the courage to venture into Lovecraft's world instead, I am treated, or subjected, to equally vivid experiences in the wild hills and dark valleys around Arkham, where, as described in The Color Out of Space, there are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. Which setting produces more shivers? The treacherous Grimpen Mire with its fantastic rock formations, or the remote byways around Arkham with their alien visitors and mysterious survivals of ancient pre-human creatures? I'd say it's a toss-up. Along with a compelling setting, all good fiction involves conflict. We want our stories to set up a clash of forces, whether a simplistic good versus evil showdown or a more nuanced struggle, such as a character confronting his own demons, internal or external. In most of the Holmes stories, a human criminal with purely human motives, such as greed, lust, or a desire for revenge, commits or attempts to commit a crime and is usually foiled or captured by Holmes's powers of deduction and skill in martial arts. Simple, direct, satisfying. There's plenty of human evil in Lovecraft's world as well, but it is often in the service of vast cosmic forces beyond our comprehension. And when humans clash with those vast cosmic forces, it generally doesn't end well for the humans. And yet, the motivations often converge. In The Adventure of the Creeping Man, one of the creepiest Holmes stories, poor old Professor Presbury just wants to recover his lost youth and lengthen his life so he can feel worthy of his beautiful young fiancée. But he tries to achieve an unnaturally extended life through purely natural means, monkey extract injections, and becomes a grotesque simian parody of himself. This is not usually the best way to a young girl's heart. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, Lovecraft gives us a similar quest for eternal youth and life, but the methods are much more otherworldly. Poor young Charles's obsessive search for antiquarian knowledge ends up awakening one of his deranged ancestors from the New England witchcraft era. That ancestor then uses his own unholy techniques, learned from the old ones from beyond, of course, to take over young Charles' body and soul. As with Professor Presbury, the results are less than ideal for all concerned. But misguided though they are, we can sympathize with the old professor and his desire for youth and long life, and with the young antiquarian and his consuming curiosity about hidden knowledge. We've all felt the desire to live more, to know more, to be more, and we've all felt the fear of what's beyond this life, what that knowledge might show us, how our curiosity and ambition might bring us to grief. We can feel those black seas of infinity, whether we try to reason them away like Holmes or run from them in terror like Lovecraft's doomed heroes. And maybe that's why Doyle and Lovecraft make such an irresistible pairing. They offer us very different but equally compelling ways to cope with the wonder, the joy, and the terror of being human. So as you venture into the world of fiction, whether through Baker Street or Arkham, keep your wits about you, your deerstalker on your head, and whatever you do, do not attract the attention of the elder gods.